All week long, I have great anticipation of this moment. I look forward to it. I long for it. As I prepare the sermon by studying the text, by ingesting this passage, I pray for you throughout, and I pray that the Lord will use it. And there's just no greater thing in my life, just on a regular, repeatable basis, that I enjoy more than getting to open the Word of God and preach to people who love the Word of God. So as we turn to Romans chapter 3, though this is a very difficult passage in the sense that it gives us tough truth, it's hard for us to hear it and to embrace it, let alone believe it. It's necessary, it's essential that we hear the verdict of God on our lives. Because if we do not know our natural condition in sin, we will seek no remedy. So read with me beginning in verse 9 of Romans chapter 3, where we pick up in this argument Paul has made really since the first chapter about lostness, about the natural condition of humanity. In verse 9, he says, "What then? Are we Jews any better off? No, not at all. For we have already charged that all, both Jews and Greeks, are under sin. As it is written, none is righteous, no, not one. No one understands. No one seeks for God. All have turned aside. Together they have become worthless. No one does good, not even one. Their throat is an open grave. They use their tongues to deceive. The venom of asps is under their lips. Their mouth is full of curses and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. In their paths are ruin and misery, and the way of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes." Now we know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be stopped, and the whole world may be held accountable to God. For by works of the law, no human being will be justified in his sight, since through the law comes the knowledge of sin. In the last 2 years, there's been an awful lot of talk about vaccines. In fact, I think it's safe to say there's been more talk about vaccines in the last 2 years than in all the rest of the years of my life combined. But you know, there's a big difference between a vaccine and an antidote. One of those you put into a perfectly healthy body in hopes of preventing some future problem, but the other you put into a body that is already in serious distress. The poison has been ingested. The viper has already struck. And you know, it strikes me that no one with a snake bite is ever worried about secret deep state tracking device microchips being in the anti-venom. I mean, if you've been bit by the snake, it's like, give me that shot. Now there's a big difference. The difference is one of potential problem versus actual distress, of having time to choose and time to die. If you go to a doctor and they run some tests on you, and the doctor says, okay, we've diagnosed it, you have a cancer, but this is an easily controlled cancer. We have a 99.99% success rate with this. It typically does not spread. You go on your vacation, you come back, call me, we'll set up a time, talk about treatment, but this is really no big deal. That's a very different thing than if you go to a doctor and they do a test on you and they say, look, you have a cancer, and we've already made arrangements for you to be transferred to Houston to MD Anderson today. And there's a specialist there, the one of only 3 in the entire country, who knows how to deal with this specific type of cancer. This is aggressive. It is deadly. We don't have a very high success rate with it all. In fact, there is no known treatment, but you need to go anyway. You know what you'll do? You'll go. And in fact, when you get there and they say to you, okay, now we have no known treatment for this. There is no known cure for this type of cancer you've got. But there are some researchers who think they might have something, and if you agree to be in a double-blind study, and now that means you got a 50% chance you'll get the experimental drug or you'll get a placebo. But frankly, there is no other cure. You know what you'll do? You'll say, put me in that study. I'll take my shot. I mean, the shot is no cure, no hope versus 50% chance I'll get an experimental drug that might help. I mean, the difference is one of desperation, right? If a doctor says, no big deal, go on your vacation, call me when you get back. Okay, you don't like having it, but he sort of sets you up that this is not a big deal, and you're okay with it. You can manage it. It doesn't sound, what's the word, urgent. But if there's a look of panic, if we've got to deal with this right now, there's very little hope. You've got to act now. There's desperation. Then you've got to act. And this is precisely the tone Paul is taking when he talks to us about lostness. There's a sense of urgency and desperation. There's not some vaccine that might help you prevent sin. You're already in it. You're already crushed under its weight. It is urgent. There is no hope but one. Now listen to Paul's logic of lostness. He began in verse 18 of chapter 1 by talking about this natural tendency in what I call the pagan man, the guy that rejects the worship of God and instead worships the creature more than the creator. And he talked about where that goes, all the different kinds of sin and sexual perversion and all those things that happen. And his logic is pagan people who reject God are lost. And we read this from the words of Paul, and we get that. Pagan people who reject God, they're lost. But in chapter 2, beginning in verse 1, he took the next step in his argument. And he talked to us about religious people. Religious people who have this law written on their hearts, and they have a sense of morality. Maybe they don't know the law of Moses. They don't know the law of God, but Paul made the argument in those first 16 verses of chapter 2 that religious people who do not perfectly keep the law, even the law that they know, they're lost. That God can judge anybody by their own law, by their own moral code, and they won't pass the test. He doesn't even have to apply his law to them. He can judge them by their own conscience, and they're lost. And then Paul turns specifically to his own people, to the Jewish people. And he says, you think that because you have circumcision that's keeping the law? No, don't you understand that if you're under the law, you're under obligation to keep the entire law, every last bit of it. If the rope breaks at any one point, it's a broken rope. You plunge to your death. Jewish people who do not perfectly keep the Mosaic law are lost. And he makes the case that there are none who do that. Therefore, in this passage today, this is the peroration of this part of his argument. He's saying, therefore, everyone is under sin. There is no human being who does not fit in any of these categories, whether they're pagan and they completely reject God and any moral code, they're lost. Or whether they're religious and moral, but they can't live up to their own standards, they're lost. Or whether they're a Jew, a descendant of Abraham, and they have the benefit of the oracles of God. They've been taught the law from their birth, but still they are incapable of saving themselves. Therefore, they are lost. And he uses this phrase, they are under sin, that the whole world is under sin. Now, how are we under sin? He says, well, are we Jews any better off? Not at all, because we've already charged that all, both Jews and Greeks, are under sin. We're crushed by its weight. We are covered by its consequences. We live in a world that is fallen and broken, and the forces of disease and death have been unleashed on us, and there's no escape from sin, from its presence, its power, its effects, its consequences. We are under sin. And so he makes the case here biblically. Verses 10 through 18 is the longest, it's what we call a chain citation. This is not from one Old Testament passage, it's from several. And Paul strings them together. But it's a quotation, and it's the longest Old Testament citation in all 13 of Paul's epistles. You got more scripture put together right here than anywhere else in any of Paul's writings. And he strings together this accusation against humanity, and it has two parts. The first section, like Paul's argument itself, speaks against the human rejection of God, that we all have rejected God. But then the second part talks about our unkindness, our crime against one another, the human violence toward one another in word and deed. Now, if you notice, that's not unlike the division of the Ten Commandments, remember? The first of the Ten Commandments, those first four are about God, about loving the Lord our God and not having idols and not profaning his name and making sure that we keep his Sabbath. And then the last six are about our responsibility toward other human beings. And Paul is here in this string citation. He's making the case that we have violated God's standard in our relationship to him, in our relationship to one another. And this opening statement, the first several verses of this citation, comes from the passage that Pastor Chris just read from Psalm 13, verses 1 and 3. He skips verse 2 because that's not germane to his argument. And he has a little bit of help from Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 20, that says there's no righteous person on the earth. And here's the case that Paul makes. How are we under sin? Well, first of all, we're under sin by birth because we're descendants of Adam. He simply makes this bold statement from Psalm 13, no one is righteous. No, not one. I know when your precious little grandchild was born, you looked at that grandchild. I'm skipping over parents here. I'm talking to grandparents because it's better. It's just better. You look at your, honestly, if you're a parent, you look at that baby and you see a bill, right? Grandparents, it's all fun and none of the hard work, but you look at your little grandchild, you think, that's a perfect, innocent child. Well, it might be through the eyes of a grandparent, but it's not through the eyes of a holy God. We're all born descendants of Adam. We're born in sin. It's not like we're born in innocence and then there's some point in our lives that we become guilty. No, we're born in sin. We might become more accountable later. We might become more aware of sin later, but we are by nature children of wrath. We're descendants of Adam and Eve. We're sinners by birth. He says, no one is righteous, no, not one. We're sinners by lack of understanding because our minds are darkened. He says in verse 11, again quoting Psalm 13, no one understands. This is what I have only half jokingly referred to in the past as our post-lapsarian noetic effects. That because of the fall, we don't even think straight. We can't think clearly. You put a husband and a wife together in a house, and they're going to look at the same event, and they're going to see it completely different. Every time, I see Tanya is the one at fault, and she sees that I'm the one at fault. And I realize that, we're both suffering from this same effect of the fall. We can't think clearly. We can't see the objective reality sometimes. We get so caught up in our emotions, in our view. And this is what Paul says, there's no one who understands. There's no one who can look at the reality of the effects of sin and see it clearly. Let me give you an example. I read an article this week about Baltimore between 1997 and 2002. I forget how many murders. They had close to 2,000 murders, only 32% of which ever had an arrest and a conviction. And it was a staggering number of people who, for lack of a better term, got off on a technicality. That a defense attorney was able to, even though there was little doubt that this person actually committed this crime, they were able to successfully argue that the police had botched it or the prosecutor didn't do his job right or something, and a staggering number of people got off. Now, as I say that, you're probably sitting there thinking, boy, that's terrible. That's awful. But now let me say that you're a parent, and you raised this kid in a very, very difficult neighborhood in Baltimore. And you've done your best to try and teach them right from wrong, but they got in with a bad bunch. One night, out with friends, they did something dumb, robbed a liquor store. One of them killed the cashier. And your son is arrested as an accomplice to murder. And a defense attorney arguing that the police botched it gets your son out of the charge and your son goes free. Now let me ask you, how do you feel about that? Does your heart feel anger that justice was not done? Or does your heart feel joy that, okay, maybe my son will straighten out. Now maybe this will teach him a lesson. Maybe he'll do right now. You see, here on earth, our sense of justice is perverted. We look at things through our own eyes and how it affects us. Let's say that there's a judge and a young man stands before him and he has committed murder. And the judge looks at him and says, hey, you know what? I see here this is your first offense. You've got a pretty good record prior to this. This is a terrible mistake you've made. But I'm going to trust that you can rehabilitate yourself, and I'm going to let you go. Now, do you say, wow, what a loving, kind judge that is? Or do you say, that's a miscarriage of justice? Depends on whether or not you're that young man. If you're that young man, you go, wow, what a loving, kind judge. He gave me another chance. If you're just about anybody else, you look at that and you say, wow, what a miscarriage of justice. Do you see? Our sense of justice really depends on whether or not we feel affected by it, whether or not we're the one being shown mercy, whether or not we are the one suffering the results of justice. And Paul says, here's how he sums that up. There's no one who understands. We aren't able to simply look at the fact of sin and the holiness of God and say, that's awful. Sin is an affront to holy God. We excuse it. We change our standards. We talk about the changing standards of society. Let me just say, society does change its standards. God does not. There are none who understand. We're under sin by disposition because we don't seek God. Oh, this is an important theological statement. Verse 11 here, quoting again from Psalm 13, no one seeks God. Sometimes people say, well, what about the guy out in the village that never heard of Jesus, never had the opportunity to put his faith in Christ, and yet, here's the phrase you'll often hear, he lives up to the light that he has. Well, that's a lovely thought. But Paul is saying no one lives up to the light that he has. Have you ever had a guilty conscience? Ever? Have you not ever done something that later you thought, man, I shouldn't have done that. I shouldn't have said that. I shouldn't have done that. Is there nothing in your life you look back at with regret? Now, don't you think that every single human being on the face of this earth knows that feeling? Is there anyone that has never had a guilty conscience? Is there anyone who's never had a regret about their own actions and morality? There's nobody who does everything he or she knows to do on all occasions, whether it's sins of omission, sins of commission, sometimes even sins of ignorance, the things that we ought to do, but we don't even know to do them, or things that are wrong, but we don't realize they're wrong. We sin in so many different ways because our disposition is wrong. No one does what he knows to do and then seeks God so that he might do more. At best, we try to do the minimum. We're under sin by choice because the phrase Paul cites here from Psalm 13 is we have all turned aside. All have turned aside. And together, he says, they have become worthless. We're under sin by incapacity. Because regarding righteousness, we're worthless. We don't have enough righteousness to justify ourselves for one day, let alone for eternity. You ever watched Antique Roadshow? Come on, how many old people are in there? Thank you, okay. I like Antique Roadshow because, it's a fantasy that we've all got something in our attic that we've been clinging to, and your wife says, oh, you need to get rid of that. You say, no, I think that's worth something. I think that baseball card is worth something. I think, that antique popcorn popper is worth something, whatever it might be. Somebody comes in with a brooch that they thought was probably costume jewelry, but they show it to the expert, and they discover it's worth $75,000. Or someone brings in a vase that he bought at a garage sale for $4.99, and the expert appraiser looks at it and tells him, where it comes from and what period it belongs in, and even the artist that made it. And he says, at an auction, this would bring as much as $100,000. Well, let me just tell you, what I'm talking about here, this is the opposite of that. You think you're a pretty good person, that you're rich in goodness and righteousness, but under the expert eye of God's holy appraisal, you are worthless. No, as I say that, some of you are sitting there saying, that's terrible that a preacher would tell people they're worthless. Don't blame me. Read it. Do you see the word? Do you see it? You might think that I'm being unkind, but the truth is, this is the greatest kindness I can do you today, is to tell you the truth of what God says about you. And when it comes to righteousness, you're worthless. Yes, you're created in the image of God, and you're worthy of dignity and respect afforded every other human being. Yes, you're worthy of my respect and my kindness, but when it comes to righteousness and eternity with God, you are worthless. Peter Doig is a famous artist from Edinburgh, Scotland. In 2015, one of his paintings sold for $26 million. A man named Robert Fletcher has a painting that he claimed he bought from Robert Doig in 1993 for $100 when Robert Doig was a young, struggling artist. And he wanted to sell it. He took it to a famous art appraiser, and the appraiser said we should be able to get $10 million for this. But they needed to make sure that it was an authentic Doig painting. And so they showed it to the alleged artist. And they said, "Did you paint this?" He said, "No, I didn't paint it. It's not mine." And so Robert Fletcher sued Peter Doig to make him admit that it was his painting, and he lost the case, and the judge said the artist does not claim it. The artist says it's worthless, therefore it's worthless. And the value of that painting that the guy thought was $10 million suddenly went to nothing. Why? Because the creator, the artist, does not acknowledge it, does not claim that it's him. Listen to me. If God does not claim you as his, you have no value. You're under sin. You're under sin by incapacity because you're worthless. You're under sin by self-identification because of what you say. Look at verses 13 and 14. This is fascinating to me. Their throat, their tongues, their lips, their mouth. Isn't it fascinating that after he deals with the way that we are with God, now here's this bridge as he's turning our attention to the way we are with our fellow human beings. And the no fear of God in our minds comes out in our speech. Isn't it interesting? It's our communication here that Paul centers on. He quotes from Psalm 5, verse 10, and Psalm 139, verse 4, and Psalm 9, verse 28 in rapid succession. Their throat is an open grave. They use their tongues to deceive. The venom of snakes is under their lips. Their mouth is full of curses and bitterness. Our own words, our speech betrays us. Remember when Peter was denying Jesus and the people standing around him said, you were with him there in the courtyard of Caiaphas. Remember that? And Peter cursed and said, "I don't even know the man." And one of them said, "No, your speech gives you away. You're a Galilean. You've got a Galilean accent. You were with that guy." I want you to know that our speech will always give us away, that we are sinners. That, as Jesus said, what is in the heart proceeds forth from the mouth. It's not what goes in us that corrupts us, it's what comes out. We're under sin by self-determination because of where we choose to go. In verse 15, he says, their feet are swift to shed blood. In their paths are ruin and misery. This is a quote from Isaiah chapter 59 and verse 7. And that is that our very path, our path is not a path of righteousness. Our path is one of violence, of one of oppression. You know, we all favor our kind more than somebody else's kind. We all favor our family over everybody else's family. We put ourselves at the center of the universe, and we're willing to hurt other people to get what we think is coming to us. Our feet are swift to shed blood, and our paths is ruin and misery. And we're under sin by self-revelation simply because we don't fear God. There's no fear of God before their eyes. Boy, we're in an age where Even Christians don't like this term, fear of God. I know Bible translators that won't use this term, fear of God, and yet I think it perfectly describes what the healthy reverence for God. To fear him is to respect him, to know that he is holy and righteous, that he has a right to do as he pleases, and he has the power and the ability to do it, and whatever he does is right. That's the fear of God. But he says there's no fear of God before their eyes, quoting Psalm 35 and verse 2. And after this rapid fire succession of Old Testament passages, all making the case that we're sinners, now Paul turns to the law, because remember, he's talked about the law written on the hearts, but he said, you don't live up to the law written on your heart. He's talked about the law of Moses. He says, you Jews, you don't keep the law of Moses. So now he's going to talk about the function of the law. Okay, if it's this bad, if we're this worthless, if we're this sinful, well, what's the purpose of the law? Why does God even give the law if we can't keep it? If the law can't clean me up and make me righteous, why does God give the law? How does the law function? He says in verse 19, now we know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law. Okay, first of all, the law indicates jurisdiction. Guess what? I don't have to keep the laws of Tennessee, do I? Unless what? Unless I'm in Tennessee. Tennessee can't pass any law that affects me in Kentucky, but the minute I cross that state line, now I'm in their jurisdiction. Here's the thing, when God gives a law, he is asserting his jurisdiction. He's saying, okay, by giving this law, first of all, I'm saying you answer to me. You are accountable to me. He's asserting jurisdiction. And when he wrote a law on our hearts, he was demonstrating his right to rule over us. He could have made us like an animal with no conscience, just merely about survival and subsistence. But he gave us a moral sense like he has, so that we know good from evil. And that law indicates his jurisdiction over us. But beyond that, Paul says it increases culpability. By giving us that law, God is saying, you're guilty and you're accountable to me. I have exercised my jurisdiction over your life by giving you that law. And now I'm showing you your guilt, your culpability, because I'm holding you accountable. He says this is that every mouth may be stopped. So none of this nonsense, when I stand before God, he's going to have to answer to me for a few things. I'm going to have some questions for him. No, trust me on this. Your mouth will be stopped. You'll have no smart aleck words for your judge. You will not put him in the dock and hold him accountable to you. If God chose simply to bring up to your memory every time you've had a guilty conscience, every time you've violated your own standards, he would not even have to judge you by the 10 Commandments or the law of Moses. He could just judge you by your own willful misdeeds that you knew you were doing wrong when you did it, and you'd be guilty. This indicates culpability, and it removes exemptions. He says that the whole world may be held accountable to God. No man on an island living up to the light he has is going to be exempted. No faithful follower of some other religion is going to be exempted because, oh, well, at least he had faith in that God, however false he may prove. No, every single human being is accountable to God, their creator, who has written his law on their hearts and given his law in his word and sent his Son as a means of salvation, and there will be no exemptions. The whole world will be held accountable to God. And furthermore, this law functions because it denies justification and confirms condemnation. God's law proves you can't save yourself. Because you have a guilty conscience, because you know things you've done that are wrong. You're not going to get to stand before God and say, yeah, but my wife did stuff that's worse. You're not going to stand before God and say, yeah, but you have no idea what somebody else did to me. No, you're going to be accountable for you. And you can't justify yourself through your own righteousness, and therefore you are condemned. By works of the law, no human being will be justified in his sight. No human being. But ultimately, this law functions to reveal sin. Paul says, since through the law comes the knowledge of sin. You know, it is possible that you might be in some foreign country and you stop at a red light, you're driving in your rental car, and you stop at a red light, nothing's coming, and you turn right on that red light, suddenly a policeman from that country pulls you over and says, you ran that red light. You say, well, officer, I came to a complete stop and then turned right. He said, yes, but that's against the law. Oh, well, in Kentucky, it's okay. And he would simply say, you're not in Kentucky. You're here in this country, and here the law. You know, it's possible that you would not know that you violated a law, and you violated it. One function of the law is to awaken our conscience and to teach us God's standards. That's a good function of the law. Unfortunately, even when we learn the law, we still break it. And this reveals sin. I cannot get out of God's jurisdiction. I cannot deny my guilt. I get no exemption or excuse. I have to admit that I know sin, that I have sinned with full knowledge. And this makes me absolutely despondent. You read the verdict of God on your life is that you are a sinner and you are guilty and you are condemned. And this absolutely drives you to despair. And that is precisely God's purpose. The law drives you to despair so the gospel can provide relief. How cruel would it be if there was a gospel relief for your sin, but God kept it from you that you were in violation of his law? What if he allowed you just to go on in ignorance so that you didn't know you were guilty and therefore you sought no relief? You did not know that the verdict has been passed down, that you deserve eternity in hell, and you just didn't concern yourself with it because you did not know your guilt. God has given us his law, and the law crushes us. It tells us that we are under sin. And the bitterness of that knowledge makes us cry out to God like the publican that Jesus talked about, smiting his breast, saying simply, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. In 2012, they started putting a flavor in antifreeze. They began to put in a bitter flavor, a bittering agent. And do you know why? Because the glycol alcohol in antifreeze tastes sweet. And people pouring it into their engines would maybe spill just a little bit on their driveways. And some cat, some dog would come, tasting the sweetness of it, lick it up. And ultimately, going into their system very quickly, it would cause renal failure. There were human beings even that would commit suicide by drinking antifreeze because it was not an unpleasant way to ingest it, though the effects certainly were. So in 2012, a few states had passed laws saying that the manufacturers of the antifreeze had to do it in their state. So all the manufacturers of antifreeze in the United States voluntarily began to add a bittering agent to their antifreeze. The law is God's bittering agent that says this will kill you. Don't run to the law as though it can save you. It cannot. It can only condemn you. It can only kill you. Don't think that somehow you're going to go to heaven because you've been a good person. Don't think that somehow by keeping the law that you can improve your status so much that God is going to say, yeah, you're good enough, come on in. No, the law is bitter. It can only condemn. I can't be justified by the law. The law has no power to justify me. The bitterness of the law only condemns me. No amount of regret I have, no amount of admission I have, no lighthearted, well, I'm only human kind of talk will free me from the effects of the law. In 1941, one night after a dance at the Lexington Country Club, three men, Skeeter Baxter, Tom Penny, and Bob Anderson, went in there and into the quarters of a female pro golfer named Marion Miley and her mother, knowing that the proceeds from that dance were there in their apartment. They went in and they murdered them for $140. All three were sent to the electric chair. Skeeter Baxter, who was the greenskeeper and the caddy from the Lexington Country Club, the inside guy who knew that they would have money that night in that apartment because of that dance. Before they led him to the electric chair, they asked him if he had any last words, and he said, yeah, I do. He said, years ago, I was dating a woman that had a baby, and she asked me to keep the baby one night while she worked. The baby began to cry. Nothing I did would make the baby stop crying. No feeding, no holding it, no singing to it, no nothing. The baby just wouldn't shut up, and I couldn't stand it. And I took a pillow and I smothered that baby and claimed that it had died in its sleep. He said, that's always troubled my conscience. And now before I die, I want to admit that. Did that admission accomplish anything? Not a thing. You see, it's not enough to simply admit you're a sinner. You cannot be justified by the law. No amount of regret, no tears of sorrow, no turning over a new leaf will justify you in the sight of God. But one day, the Son of God hung between two thieves, and he died in my place so that I can be justified by grace alone. Now, this is where Paul's going. This is the great exchange. That I'm saved not by keeping the law or by being righteous. Here's the miracle of miracles, but through faith alone. Through faith alone. I cannot keep the law. I can't atone for any sin I've ever committed. But when I accept God's word, not only for my sin, that I'm a sinner and that I'm guilty and I am condemned to hell, but when I accept his word about salvation, about the forgiveness that is available to me, when I believe what his word says, that he loved me, a sinner, so much that he gave his own son to go to Calvary's cross in my place so that he could take God's own wrath and condemnation on him instead of me, so that I can go free, so that I can have eternity with him. I can't be justified by the law, but I can by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone. And that is the good news. It condemns us and crushes us to know that we're guilty before God, that our mouths are stopped. There's no excuse, no exemption. But if you'll take God at his word, the only antidote to the deadly sin of your nature is the gracious salvation that Jesus accomplished by his death, burial, and resurrection, and it's yours for the asking. It's yours.